There is a particular kind of person you will almost certainly meet in your lifetime, and the strange part is you probably won't recognize them right away. They won't raise their voice. They won't threaten you. In fact, in the beginning, they might be the most attentive, most devoted, most reassuring person you've ever met. And that is exactly what makes them so hard to see coming. Somewhere between the first conversation and the moment you finally understand what happened, years can pass. Sometimes an entire relationship, sometimes an entire childhood. And when people finally look back and try to pinpoint the moment it started, most of them can't. Because control, real control, the kind that reshapes another human being from the inside out, was never designed to be noticed. It was designed to feel like love. This is a story about that mechanism, not a checklist of warning signs, not a list of red flags to screenshot and forget. A story about where the need to control another person actually comes from, why it hides so well inside affection, and why some of the most intelligent, capable people you know can spend years standing inside it without ever seeing the walls. Picture for a moment a courtship that felt almost too good to be real. Someone who remembered small details you'd mentioned only once. Someone who seemed to understand you faster and more completely than anyone ever had. In the beginning, there were no arguments because there was nothing yet to disagree about. The relationship simply felt like being finally, fully seen. Then slowly, almost too slowly to notice, the questions changed shape. Where were you? Who were you with? Why did that comment upset you so much? Each one wrapped in concern, each one reasonable enough on its own to explain away. Years later, describing it to a therapist, the person at the center of that story will often use the exact same phrase, "I didn't see it happening." Nobody ever does in the moment. They only see it in the rearview mirror, once the shape of the whole road finally comes into view. To understand it, we have to go back further than any relationship, any family, any office. We have to go back to a time before language, before agriculture, before anything resembling the modern self, to a period when survival depended on one brutally simple variable: your position in the group. For most of human history, being cast out of your tribe wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. No protection from predators, no shared food during a bad season, no one to help raise your children. So the human brain evolved an intense, almost obsessive sensitivity to social standing, to hierarchy, to who held influence over whom. And the individuals who instinctively understood how to secure influence, how to make others depend on them, defer to them, orbit around them, were often the ones whose bloodlines survived. In other words, the drive to control other people isn't some modern personality defect. It's an ancient survival strategy, inherited, refined, and quietly running in the background of the human nervous system long after the world stopped ruckering it. But surviving in a small tribe of 30 people is very different from navigating a modern marriage, a modern office, a modern family. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because in a world where physical dominance no longer guarantees survival, the drive to control didn't disappear. It just changed its methods. Psychologist Philip Zumbutter spent his career studying what happens when ordinary people are handed power over others. In his famous prison simulation at Stanford, ordinary college students, randomly assigned the role of guard, began adopting controlling, dehumanizing behavior within days, not because they were inherently cruel, but because the situation itself created a hunger for control that most of them didn't know they carried. Zumbutter's work revealed something unsettling. The capacity for controlling behavior isn't reserved for a rare, damaged few. It's sitting dormant in ordinary psychology, waiting for the right conditions to activate it. So what activates it in everyday life? What turns an ordinary person into someone who needs to manage another human being's choices, emotions, and boundaries? The answer, more often than not, is not power, it's fear. Beneath almost every controlling person you will ever meet is a nervous system that experiences uncertainty as danger, not mild discomfort, danger. Psychiatrist John Bulber, whose research reshaped how we understand human attachment, found that early relationships teach the developing brain a template for what closeness is supposed to feel like. Children who grow up with inconsistent caregiving, love that appears and disappears unpredictably, often develop an attachment style built around one core belief: connection cannot be trusted unless it is managed. And a mind that learns, early and repeatedly, that love is unreliable unless controlled will often grow into an adult who quietly, sometimes unconsciously, tries to manage every relationship the same way, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, deeply buried attempt to never again feel the powerlessness of childhood. This is the part almost nobody expects. Controlling people are rarely trying to hurt you. They are trying to prevent an old, unbearable feeling from ever happening again, and you have simply become the mechanism they use to do it. Which brings us to the part of the story that makes control so difficult to identify from the inside. it almost never begins with control. It begins with intensity. Robert Saldanha, who spent decades studying the psychology of influence, identified a set of principles that quietly govern human decision-making, principles like reciprocity, commitment, and liking. Controlling people, whether they've studied psychology or not, tend to be instinctively fluent in exactly these principles. They give generously early, so you feel an unspoken debt. They mirror your interests and values with uncanny precision, so you feel instantly understood. They move quickly toward emotional closeness, so that by the time any red flag appears, you've already invested too much to walk away without pain. This isn't cynical calculation in most cases. It's a learned pattern, reinforced over a lifetime because it works. Psychologist Albert Bandura's research on social learning showed that human beings don't need direct punishment or reward to learn bahavak. We learn simply by watching what gets results in the people around us. A child who watches a parent secure love through guilt or control a household through withdrawal and silence doesn't need anyone to explain the mechanism. They absorb it as the operating manual for how relationships work. So the affection you feel at the beginning isn't fake. That's what makes it so disorienting. It's often genuine. It's simply attached to a system that requires your compliance to keep functioning. And the moment that compliance wavers, the mechanism reveals itself. This is where guilt enters the story, not as an accident, but as one of the most efficient tools available to a controlling mind, because guilt requires no confrontation, no risk, no visible aggression. A sigh, a long pause, a single sentence beginning with, "I just thought you cared enough to." Guilt works because it doesn't attack you. It recruits your own conscience to do the work for it. When guilt doesn't fully work, a colder tool often follows: silence. Neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger's research on social exclusion revealed something that reframes the entire concept of the silent treatment. Using brain imaging, she found that social rejection activates the same neural region, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, that activates during physical pain. Being frozen out by someone you love doesn't just feel like pain metaphorically. Your brain processes it as an actual injury, which means the person withholding affection isn't just creating distance. On a neurological level, they are inflicting something your nervous system interprets as real harm, and the fastest way to make that harm stop is almost always to return to compliance. If guilt and silence still aren't enough, control often escalates into something more sophisticated, rewriting reality itself. Psychotherapist Robin Stern spent years documenting a pattern she named the gaslight effect, describing how a person can be slowly, methodically convinced that their own memory, perception, and judgment cannot be trusted. It rarely happens through one dramatic lie. It happens through repetition. A calm, confident denial delivered consistently enough over a long enough period that the target's trust in their own mind erodes faster than their trust in the person distorting it. And here is the detail almost nobody talks about. This doesn't require a villain twirling a mustache. It requires only consistency, calm delivery, and time, which is exactly why it works on intelligent, self-aware people just as easily as it works on anyone else. Intelligence was never the variable being exploited. Trust was. When control can no longer be maintained one-on-one, it often expands outward, recruiting others into the system. Family therapist Murray Bowen, studying dysfunctional family units, identified a pattern he called triangulation. Instead of resolving tension directly with the person involved, a controlling individual pulls in a third party, a sibling, a friend, a colleague, and quietly reshapes the narrative through them. You become difficult, ungrateful, unstable. Not because anyone confronted you directly, but because a story was built about you in rooms you were never invited into. This is one of the cruelest extensions of control, precisely because it's nearly invisible to defend against. You cannot correct a narrative you were never told existed. But every system of control requires two participants, and it would be incomplete to tell this story without asking the harder question: why do some people stay so long inside it? Roy Baumeister's research on belonging suggests that the need for connection isn't a soft, optional preference in human psychology. It behaves like a biological drive, closer to hunger or thirst than to a simple want. And people who learned early, through inconsistent caregiving or conditional approval, that love had to be earned through vigilance and accommodation, often grow into adults with a finely tuned instinct for anticipating what others need before they need it. It looks from the outside like exceptional empathy. From the inside, it often functions as a survival skill, refined in a childhood where safety depended on reading a room correctly. This is why controlling people and people-pleasers so often find each other, not through bad luck, but through a kind of psychological magnetism. One system is built to manage, the other is built to accommodate, and for a while, tragically, it feels less like a trap and more like compatibility. By now, a pattern should be forming, and it's worth naming directly. Almost every tool a controlling person uses, guilt, silence, distorted memory, recruited allies, shares one underlying function. They are all designed to make disagreement more costly than compliance, not through force, through psychological weight. And this is precisely why boundaries provoke such an intense reaction from controlling people. A boundary isn't just a preference being stated. To a mind that equates control with safety, a boundary is the sound of the entire system beginning to fail. Here, behavioral psychology offers something genuinely unsettling. In operant conditioning research, when a behavior that has always been reinforced suddenly stops receiving that reinforcement, it doesn't quietly fade away. It intensifies first. Psychologists call this an extinction burst, a sudden spike in the very behavior you're trying to stop, right before it finally weakens. A vending machine that stops dispensing snacks doesn't just get ignored. People shake it, hit it, try the buttons again and again, with more force than before. Now picture a controlling relationship in exactly the same terms. For years, guilt worked, silence worked, compliance always eventually returned. And then one day it doesn't, the boundary holds. And instead of the controlling behavior simply stopping, it often gets worse before it gets better. More guilt, colder silence, more urgent attempts to pull you back into the old pattern. This isn't proof that you did something wrong. It's proof that the system is finally breaking, and the person operating it is instinctively fighting the only way they know how. In romantic relationships specifically, this extinction burst often takes its most convincing shape because it borrows the exact language of romance itself. The sudden flood of affection, the apology that sounds, for the first time in months, completely sincere, the promise that things will be different now, delivered with a kind of desperate conviction that can feel more real than anything that came before it. It rarely is a performance in the cynical sense. In that moment, the person delivering it often means every word, but meaning it in the moment and sustaining it once the old uncertainty fades back into the background are two very different things, and the pattern, given enough time, almost always resumes. Socially, this same instinct extends outward far beyond any single relationship. A controlling person rarely needs to manipulate an entire room at once. They only need to secure a few key allies, people who will vouch for their character if questioned, who will describe them as generous, misunderstood, patient beyond reason. This is not paranoia to notice. It is simply how reputational insulation works, built quietly. One favor and one good impression at a time, long before it's ever needed. This mechanism doesn't stay confined to romantic relationships. It moves through families, shaping who gets praised and who gets punished for having their own opinions, the child labeled the difficult one simply for being the first to say no. It moves through workplaces too, in ways that rarely announce themselves as control at all. A manager who praises loyalty more than competence. A team where dissent is met not with argument, but with a subtle, cooling withdrawal of warmth, fewer invitations to the room where decisions get made, a slow reply to your emails, a compliment that used to come easily now conspicuously absent. Nobody writes any of this down. Nobody could point to a single policy that enforces it. And yet everyone in that office learns, quickly and wordlessly, exactly how much independent thought the room can tolerate before the temperature drops. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's research on the disproportionate power of negative experiences helps explain why these environments feel so consuming. Bad interactions, criticism, punishment, withdrawal weigh far more heavily on the human mind than good ones. One controlling outburst can psychologically outweigh a dozen kind gestures, which is exactly why people so often describe these dynamics as feeling inescapable, even when on paper the good moments seem to outnumber the bad. And there is a reason so many people don't recognize any of this until years after it began. Leon Festinger's research on cognitive dissonance revealed that human beings have a powerful, almost automatic drive to keep their beliefs and their reality aligned, even when reality is deeply uncomfortable. If you love someone and that same person hurts you, holding both truths at once creates unbearable internal tension. So the mind, quietly, protectively, resolves the tension. It minimizes the harm, it rationalizes the behavior, it tells itself, they only do this because they love me so much, not because you are gullible. Because your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do, reduce psychological pain as efficiently as possible, even at the cost of seeing the truth clearly. This is how control becomes invisible. Not through a single dramatic moment, but through thousands of small accommodations, each one reasonable in isolation, each one quietly adjusting your sense of what normal looks like, until one day you're living inside a version of reality that would have seemed unthinkable to the person you used to be. And then, sometimes years later, something small happens. A stranger treats you with uncomplicated kindness. A friend reacts with shock at something you described so casually you'd forgotten it wasn't normal. and the entire structure, built slowly, invisibly, over years, becomes visible all at once, and you're left standing in the wreckage of a version of yourself you didn't fully realize you'd been living in. It rarely arrives as a single revelation. More often, it arrives as a slow accumulation of small, disorienting comparisons, the way other people's relationships look from the outside, the way silence feels in a house that isn't managing you, the sudden, unfamiliar quiet of not having to check anyone's mood before deciding how to feel about your own day. And somewhere in that quiet, the old explanation you'd been carrying, that you were simply too sensitive, too difficult, too much, starts to sound less like a fact and more like something you were taught to believe. Here is the part of this story that deserves to be sat with long after the video ends. The need to control another human being rarely comes from strength. It comes from a nervous system that learned, somewhere along the way, that uncertainty is unbearable, and that the only way to feel safe is to make sure nothing, and no one, can move without permission. Which means every act of control you have ever witnessed, the guilt, the silence, the rewritten memories, the recruited allies, was never really about you. It was about someone else's unresolved fear, wearing your name as its target. And perhaps the most haunting realization of all is this: the same species capable of splitting the atom, mapping the human genome, and sending machines to the edge of the solar system still cannot, in most cases, teach its own nervous system that safety was never something that had to be taken from someone else. It was only ever something we had to learn how to give ourselves.